Hello everybody and welcome to the Ray White Landlord Academy. I'm Zach Snelling, the Head of Property Management for Ray White New Zealand, and I'm going to be your host for the next 4 weeks. Thank you so much for joining us live this evening. Now every year when we do our Ray White Rent event, we're usually in person, we're in our offices, we've got drinks, we've got canapes, the works. However, obviously this year we've decided to do things a little differently because, well, it's 2020 and it's the year of doing things differently. So thank you for joining us in this new format. Now also too, there's going to be a lot of resources and education coming your way across the next 4 weeks. So please keep your eyes peeled for that. But I'm very mindful of the fact that for everyone watching tonight, you're all at different stages in your landlord journey. Some of you are just investigating property investment now, you're just dipping your toe into the water. Some of you may have 1 or 2 investment properties, some of you may have many more. No matter where you sit in that journey, it doesn't matter because there's going to be something for everyone in the content we're about to deliver to you. So keep your eyes peeled, sit back and enjoy the ride. Now also too as well, every week I'll be joined by a special guest, and this week we have a very special guest to kick things off. Peter Wolfkamp, welcome mate, how are you going? Thanks for joining us.
I'm doing well and thank you, and this is a great opportunity to talk about, I guess, one of my passions, which is housing, and hopefully to be part of encouraging other people who are landlords to get their act together, understand what the act is really. It's all about the legislation now.
And again, Pete, I have to say a huge thank you for joining us. And I've done a little research on you, and you're a very experienced man here, licensed building practitioner, New Zealand Green Building Council, the resident builder, obviously that's where we've met a few times.
Yep.
The Block NZ site foreman, TV presenter and personality, and my favourite, I just slipped that one in there tonight, all round nice guy.
Yeah, look, to be honest, it's more about the paint that I managed to get off my hands at this stage. So, look, I'm on the tools a lot of the time. So I suppose what I'm hoping to bring to this is that insight into the buildings that we are renting out, and also, over the years, the work that I've done with landlords.
And tell us, Peter, you've been to a few events before. For landlords watching now, why should they hang around for the 4-part series? What's your experience with our Ray White Rent events previously?
Look, I think without wanting to scare people off straight away, the reality is there is a lot more legislation. And people have kind of got their heads around, the RTA, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act that came into force last year. There is more legislation coming. There is a temptation, I think, for New Zealanders to go, all rules, I don't want to know, and that's not going to cut it anymore.
Well, we're going to tell them everything they need to know across the next 4 weeks. So hang in there, guys. Join us every Thursday. Look, I wanted to highlight for Peter, for the audience, why we're doing this Landlord Academy series. And for the thousands of registrations we've had so far, there have been hundreds and hundreds of questions coming through. What you can see up behind you now typifies these types of questions. So we've got, tell me what I need to know so I don't get fined, from Helen and Petone. Confirm all the basic changes that are happening, Dan in Auckland there. Sophie down in Queenstown says all the legal requirements to ensure compliance. Just give me all of them. And my favourite there, Paul from Kerry, heat pump sizing. Now, the reason I highlight these questions is because in essence they are quite simple questions. However, unfortunately, the reality is there are no simple answers. Look, we've got 4 sessions across the next month, Pete. This is the first one. They're 45 minutes each and we're only scratching the surface. So I really wanted to highlight to people just the depth of what is there. Pete, do you think landlords actually grasp the level of legislation and compliance that they now have to adhere to?
I suspect that if you've been a landlord for a period of time and you've sort of been the accidental landlord, the mum and pop sort of investors, you probably don't really appreciate it, and maybe that's because you haven't had to bother with it in the past. Well, now you do, and then when you do start to look at the legislation, I think it's easy to be daunted by the amount of detail.
And again, that's why we're hosting the series, because the level of detail can be daunting. Look, we manage more than 19,000 properties across New Zealand, spread across over 180 offices. Legislation and compliance for us is a full-time job. Even with the level of support we provide our property managers, we still struggle to keep up at times. And I wanted to highlight some of these stats that have come through from our registration. And a survey we did of our network. So 81% of our landlords, Pete, across Ray White, they own 1 or 2 rental properties. And I would sort of assume this trend is across the board. 62% of all of you watching right now, when you registered, you self-registered as a DIY landlord. So I'm a little worried. If we've got 1 or 2 rental properties, it's probably not a full-time business, it's something on the side. I mean, 2/3 of you are saying you're DIY landlords. If 19,000 properties across 180 offices, we're struggling to keep up. I don't know how these landlords are doing it. So Pete, where would landlords go? How do they keep up with the information they need to know?
I guess the first thing to me would seem that you have to have the right attitude towards it. And if in the past that was, well, look, I've managed to acquire another property and I found someone to live in it and that's the end of it. That's not going to cut it anymore. So this is the same in all of our workplaces. Construction industry now, look at what you need to do in terms of compliance for health and safety. If you're working in the food industry, the rules around that would be radically different. All sorts of industries, we're having to be more accountable. And I think this legislation is going to hold you accountable. And so you need to know what you need to know, and then you need to do what you need to do. You can't hide from this.
There's no hiding anymore, ladies and gentlemen. And look, I'm going to level with you. I'm going to be honest. Another reason we're doing the Landlord Academy series is because we need more properties. We need more landlords. 3/4 of our Ray White property managers have said in a survey we recently did that tenant demand is basically skyrocketing. And this is across the board in all areas of New Zealand. And I worry that some landlords see this compliance, they see the legislation, and they think it might be a reason to get out of the market because it's simply too hard. The fact is, last month in October, we had 28,000 tenant inquiries to view our rental properties in 1 month. What we want to do with the Landlord Academy series is give you all the information, all of the tools, the resources, whether you work with us or you choose to do it independently. We want to help you get over this compliance hump, because if you do and you remain in the investment market, you will reap the rewards. We want to provide more good quality houses to good quality Kiwi tenants all across New Zealand. Pete, if we've got a landlord watching tonight who's thinking, look, there's too much legislation, even as you see it roll out over the next 4 weeks, I'm going to get out of the market, I'm going to sell. What's your advice to them?
I think, when first confronted with it feels like a tidal wave coming at you, right? And my feeling is that sort of let that break onto the shore and then pick through the details. And I guess if you're a landlord who has, in a sense, neglected your property for a period of time, or you've taken a really kind of laid-back attitude to it, then you probably do have quite a lot of work to do. If you're a landlord who's been active in the maintenance of the property in particular, then I don't think you're going to find the compliance difficult. Saying that, I had a conversation with someone the other day. They were talking about 60 properties that they knew, and at this point in time, they had one that was fully Healthy Homes compliant. So there's work to be done.
And more on that later as well, but it's just stay in the market, hang in there guys, we will get there. So we've got a lot of content to get through tonight for everyone, and Pete, we want to get you away home when you can. So we'll keep cracking. I want to give everyone an overview of what you've got to expect in the next 4 weeks. So we're going to be joining you live every Thursday at 7 p.m, but don't worry, if you miss any of the content, we'll be sending that through to you. You can always re-watch this back. You don't have to pause it, you can come back, take your notes, all the rest of it. Each week we're going to aim for around 45 minutes, give or take. And also too, like I said, there's a lot of free resources coming your way. Tonight we're going to be highlighting one of those. You can request these resources now from your Ray White Property Management Office. And again, at the end of the series, I'm going to send them all through to you. So one more thing, at the end of tonight, we're actually going to be going through a lot of questions that we've already received. But if you have questions now and you want us to try and answer these at the end, please send them through. We're going to give this a crack live, so keep it clean, guys, keep it clean. But send them through to academy@raywhite.com and we will cover those off. But don't worry, if we miss any of your questions, we will get through to those in the more relevant sessions as we get through the weeks. So how does that all sound, Pete?
Well, I think it's outstanding. And look, this guide is great. And to be honest, I think the thing with Kiwis in general is we're not great with rules in general, but for me going through it, I'd like to think that I've got a reasonable level of knowledge around the compliance, but day on day, the more I'm reading and going to the web and so on, I'm learning all the time. So we've all got a lot to learn.
Never stop learning, that's the key, especially in rentals and property management. Now look, to give you an overview of what you're going to get in the next 4 weeks, because I want to make sure you join us, hang in there, come back every Thursday night, because there's a lot of good content. So tonight we're going to be doing a bit of a pick and mix sort of lollybag. It's the general compliance, it's what you need to know now, some of the key dates, some of the key compliance issues that are coming up. Like I said, we're going to be talking about our landlord compliance guide and checklist. We're also going to be discussing how you can get your property rent ready so that you've got a ready property to put tenants in straight away without any delays. And finally, you've sent through hundreds of questions. We're going to pick through the most common ones and answer those tonight as well. Session 2, this is coming up next Thursday. I'll be joined by Joanne Ray, the Head of Property Management for the Real Estate Institute. This is going to be a big one. If any of you have questions around the healthy home standards, you're going to have to join us then. We'll be deep diving into each of the 5 standards, what you need to do to comply, how much that may cost, what the exemptions are, how you can get your assessments done, all sorts of good stuff there. And yes, there will be another guide. It's a healthy homes checklist. So you can measure your rental property you have now and see how that stacks up. Thirdly, this is going to be another huge one. Pete, you mentioned the RTA Act before, and woof, she's a biggie. So Thursday the 19th, join us with Craig Williams from Tenancy Practice Service. Now they're a consultancy group that right now as we speak are training property managers all over New Zealand on the RTA Amendments Act. We're going to be going through what those changes are, and I think for landlords watching now, more importantly, how this is going to change your process. There's a few new things you're going to have to do, so join us for that session. And again, yes, there's going to be another resource. Now to wrap things up, the final session for us on Thursday the 26th of November, this is a bit of a property investment power up. We're going to be helping you see the future of property investment, and I'll be joined by the CEO of Loan Market, Brian Greer. So in that 4th and final session, we'll be discussing things like different debt structures to make sure you're set up correctly. And look, Loan Market New Zealand currently settle around $5 billion worth of loans every single year, so they know their stuff. We're going to be also looking at what our most in-demand rental properties are, so you can pick out the best investment for your portfolio, mortgage rate trends for 2021, some crystal ball gazing, all sorts of stuff there. How does that sound, Pete?
Look, in that last section there's a lot. If you're trying to do lending at the moment, by all accounts, banks are demanding a lot more information. It's not as straightforward as it has been in the past. So, look, knowledge is power. The more information you can get, the better.
Now, I'm going to let you put me on the spot here, Pete.
Sure.
Before we get into it, do you have any questions, or do you want to just rip straight in?
Look, I think I got a power of questions, and we talked last weekend, and as a result of that, I got so many calls to the radio show on Sunday, people desperately needing information. And I guess the biggest thing is, where do you think the best place is to go for information?
Well, I'm a little biased. So I'm going to say check out your Ray White Property Manager.
This is great.
I know we've got
this
hundreds
really is
watching
good.
across New Zealand now, but they have these resources. And look, whether you work with us or not, whether you're DIY landlord, we are here to help. So definitely talk to us.
Yep.
You've got some great websites like tenancy.govt.nz. I'm going to highlight a few of those at the end of the session. But you're not alone. You've got plenty of support. So one of the key things that came up, Pete, throughout our session was actually all around the healthy home standards. There was question after question after question. Now, join us next week. This will be the deep dive, but I wanted to run through some of the compliance dates. So you're quite familiar, Pete, with the heating, insulation, ventilation, moisture ingress drainage, draft stopping?
Yeah, and I've been going through it, and I kind of just want to take a step back, because sometimes when we start to talk about this legislation, it's as if it was a burden, right? An imposition on people who are landlords. The reality is, and over the last couple of years, I've done a lot more talking about, getting better houses, and I think we deserve better houses. Definitely. We as individuals do, and the people who are renting properties, they do as well. And, if you look at the health effect of poor living conditions, the impact on the economy, hours lost from school and from workplaces and so on, a lot of these things are directly attributable to people living in poor quality housing. So, as a human being, as a citizen, I want everyone to have better standards of housing. And I think that my attitude to the legislation is that they have distilled down the really, really important things. Building is both deceptively simple and incredibly complex at the same time. And so the legislation, I think, to me, is a series of signposts that say these are the critical elements in getting a better performing building. So if you understand that, if your approach to the legislation is it's about a better building, you're probably going to be more focused on the outcomes rather than hooked on and sort of tripped up by the tiny little details of everything. Details important, but we're on the path to getting better houses, and that's what I'm excited about.
And there's a lot of misconception too. I mean, anyone watching, you'll find next week we're going to go through some of the most common costs and how much getting things up to standard is really going to cost a landlord. It's not as much as people think. And like you said, the end result is going to be a healthier home, health impacts for our country, better quality, happier tenants.
Yep.
I think it's all good.
Yeah, I do too. And you can argue about it and you can say it's an imposition on landlords and so on. But I think for arguably, for the good of the country, better housing is good for all of us.
One thing I did want to cover off though tonight, Pete, because we were getting so many questions and I thought I didn't want to keep you all waiting till next week, was these compliance deadlines. So we're going to look at, for landlords watching now, the deadlines you have to consider when it comes to healthy homes.
Yep.
First of all, if you're watching right now, you already have a compliance requirement in place for healthy homes. This is your healthy home statement of intent. So any new or renewed tenancy agreement or any existing tenancy agreement you've signed probably within the last 12 months or so must have this statement in there. It's a very simple couple of sentences. It's sort of along the lines of, I, Pete, understand the healthy home standards. I know what will be coming and my property will comply by the time that it has to.
Here it is here. I printed it off a couple of days ago to have a look through it. I've read through it. I've tried to see whether there's something there that I couldn't answer, as someone who has a general information about the property that they own and that they might be renting out. And I think, you might have to do a little bit of homework, but most people will be able to get through this.
And that's the next one coming up. So the first one is just your little couple of sentences, but the one you're just referring to is the next deadline, December 1, 2020. This is your Healthy Homes Compliance Statement. So this is the 13-page document that Pete's referring to. There's a lot of information in there around each of the standards, how your property complies. If you want to have a look at that tonight, you can ask one of our property managers for a copy, or obviously head to tenancy.govt.nz. It's the Tenancy Services website. Have a look at the statement and get prepared for what you'll need for most new or renewed tenancy agreements as of December 1 this year. It is fast approaching.
Yeah.
Pete, you've got the experience to fill that out, but I'm not sure many landlords do.
Yeah, even if, with a bit of reading around, a bit of understanding about what your property is actually constructed from. If someone has done the insulation, then you should have had the certificate from when that was done. I still have a sneaking suspicion that there is a large number, and we're talking tens of thousands of houses, that probably still don't comply with the legislation that came in last July around the insulation. There are some things in here that might be a little bit scary in terms of how do I work out ducting and ventilation and things like that. But there's actually a lot of guides in this document to help you fill it out. Definitely. So just knuckle down, do a bit of homework, and you'll get there.
Well, and that's the key point. This is your December 1, 2020 deadline, which leads into the one I've highlighted there in the lovely Ray White yellow. This is your big one. July 1, 2020 is when you must comply with all of the standards. Now, I put 90 days max there because basically after that date, anytime you sign a new tenancy agreement or you renew an existing one, you have no more than 90 days to meet all of the standards. So this is the heating standard, the heat pump's got to be in, the underfloor moisture barrier, your insulation may have to be topped up in the ceiling. Come July next year, you've got 90 days after the start of any tenancy to have it all done. So Pete, you're looking through the statement, you're getting across it. This is what landlords need to do. They need to start getting prepared.
But can I just drill down through some of that as well? That in terms of the legislation, it is for, let's say you have an existing tenant right now, and that person's been with you a couple of years, and in fact they intend to stay for another, can't tell the future, but let's say they want it, you expect them to be there for another 5 years. In effect, the way the legislation is written, you don't actually need to do anything on that property by the 1st of July, but you will need to do it in 2 or 3 years' time.
Pete, you are the perfect guest.
Okay.
That is a nice little segue.
I'm trying to get my way through this.
Yep, this is perfect because that segues into the final deadline that you can see on your screen there. So in that example Pete was just referencing, where you've got a long-standing tenant, they might have been with you for 3 or 4 years already. Let's crystal ball gaze, they might be with you for another 3 or 4. If you have a long-term sitting tenant with absolutely no changes to your tenancy or your tenancy agreement, come July 1, 2024, you still have to comply. That is the absolute deadline. Right. So again, 3.5 years, it doesn't seem like it's too far away, and it will come up very quickly.
Yeah. The other thing that I've found interesting in discussions that I've had is that some landlords are kind of thinking, well, I can just opt out. I've talked to my tenant, the tenant doesn't mind, and maybe I've discounted the rent a little bit, so I don't mind, they don't mind, why do we need to comply? What's the answer to that?
Great question. We're covering that off a little bit later, but
Okay.
let's touch on it now
Yeah.
because it's key. Some landlords, one of the questions we had was around heating, and they said,
Yep.
look, I've got to put in a massive heat pump into my lounge. My tenant doesn't want it. They're willing to sign something to say that it's not needed. The issue there, though, is that even if you do that, you're at risk of the tenant changing their mind at some point and saying, hey, look, let's go to the tribunal because I'd like to get my $4,000 compensation and fine. You're at the mercy no matter what your agreement is in place. So again, if you don't comply or you choose not to, you have that risk hanging over you. If that happens, you end up in the tribunal, they will say, Mr. or Mrs. Landlord, here's your $4,000 fine payable to the tenant. And we're also going to put a court order in place that forces you to still put the heat pump in.
Yeah.
So you're going to have the cost of the heat pump plus the fine. I certainly wouldn't recommend any of those kinds of agreements with tenants because it's a very trust-based sort of decision, and ultimately you're trying to get around the healthy home standards. I think any landlord who's looking to get around the standards, like you said earlier, they don't really get the point of them.
Yeah.
You know, like, let's work towards it. We've got plenty of time. Let's just get stuck in. But the key thing is just working towards these deadlines now and asking for help, because we're here to help.
Absolutely.
Now, let's get into the big one. This is part 3 of our series. Ladies and gentlemen, this is huge. This is the RTA Amendments Act 2020. This is the big change that's bringing in almost 100 new changes to the existing legislation. It is massive. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, Pete. How across the changes are you so far?
Look, I think 100 new changes. I mean, you get the privilege of, or the burden of actually trying to read through all of the legislation to distill it down. So I'm going to wait for you to do your work, and then I'm going to pick up on the juicy bits at the end.
Fantastic. Well, join us in part 3, Pete, and you can request your RTA Amendments Act quick guide, and I'll tell you all you need to know. But look, again, this was one of those questions that came up hundreds of times from all of those of you who've registered for the event, and I wanted to cover that off tonight. So just so you know what's happening with the RTA Amendments Act, there is already one change in effect. So if you're watching this now as a landlord, this has already impacted you. This is around rent increases. So as of right now, any rent increase you send to a tenant cannot be within 12 months of the last increase, or it cannot be within 12 months of the start date of the tenancy. The existing notice period of 60 days still remains in place. However, that's the big change. So just consider any time you do a rent increase now, for that tenancy, you're locking yourself into that time frame. So just be mindful of that. But again, I've highlighted the big ones. This is February 11, 2021, the effective date of the bulk of the changes. Ladies and gentlemen, there is so much here. I'm going to try and cover off a little bit of it now, but one of the changes is around rental tenure. So these are the notice periods you can give to tenants. So obviously the pre-existing 90-day no reason termination for periodic tenancies will be removed. If you sell your property after this date, what was 42 days notice at unconditional date now becomes 90 days. There's all sorts of changes here around how long tenants can stay in properties and your obligations as a landlord in terms of the notice you must give. This is going to be a really big one, and it's impacting people already, particularly if you're trying to sell your property. The next one here is around fixed term changes. So after February the 11th next year, currently if you have a fixed term now, you can say, hey Peter, your fixed term ends on tomorrow. No, actually you need to give more notice than that. But yeah, your fixed term's coming up for ending in a month. Unfortunately, we're not going to renew that. That's going to be the end of it, and you just have to go, okay, cool, that's how it is. When these changes come into effect, a fixed term cannot end unless the tenant agrees to it. And if there's any disagreement between the parties, it will automatically revert to a periodic tenancy. So again, that's going to be another big one. Look, this next one seems to be one which seems to be scaring a lot of landlords around minor alterations. It's not as bad as it sounds. Under the new rules, you do have to allow any alteration that a tenant requests, as long as it can be proven to be minor. However, there's an agreement you can have in place, so you can dictate what the change is, where it occurs, what happens after the tenancy in terms of the tenant putting the property back to its original state. This one will come down to your agreement and the paperwork, and it's where we sort of highlighted before where landlords now, you can't be the DIY landlord just hoping for the best. Yeah. If you don't have these sorts of agreements, that's where things will get in trouble. Pete, minor alterations, your thoughts?
Yeah, I picked up on this reading some of the stuff as well, and if someone says, look, I've got a shelf that I want to put on the wall, and I'm using a space for an office. My understanding is that they must, the landlord or the tenant rather, has to apply in writing to do that. Now, if you don't reply, if you're a bit slack getting back, then that's taken as go ahead and do it. So, that's that whole thing around, I guess, having systems in place and being on top of your management of the property. So let's say it does go ahead. I guess you've lost that opportunity to potentially add into the contract and say, fine, go ahead and do that. But upon the end of this tenancy, we expect that it's going to be reinstated to, can you set a quality level?
Yep, for the minor alterations, you can dictate where it's going to go, how it's going to change, and how it's going to be put back.
Right. And so at the end of the tenancy, the person has to reinstate it as per it was when they moved in. And I think that's fine. Is there a definition of minor?
Well, again, all of these definitions and rules, they're going to, if there's any point of trying to challenge it or debate it, it's going to be in front of an adjudicator at the tenancy tribunal. So this is the decision around, it's at the individual at the tribunal is going to say what's minor and what's not. And you raise a really interesting point. So with the minor alterations, and we're really going to deep dive into this in part 3 of our Landlord Academy series, but Peter's right, a tenant has to request a minor alteration in writing. However, if a landlord doesn't respond within a set time frame, you can actually be fined for simply not responding.
Right.
So stay tuned for part 3 because it sounds like a lot of people need to be. Look, we'll keep moving through because we've got a lot of content to get through tonight and we've got some good questions there as well. Look, the next one is tenancy assignment. So this is a big one as well, where if you've got a fixed term, Pete, with part of these rules, I can say, hey, Pete, I've got this new tenant that I'd like to take over my lease, and we can't unreasonably withhold that right to do so. However, for landlords worrying about that, you still have every right to check and vet and make sure that is an appropriate tenant. And if it's not an appropriate tenant, you don't have to accept the tenancy assignment.
Right.
So another key change there, there's going to be changes around fibre broadband, privacy and justice issues at the tenancy tribunal with names being scrubbed from any orders. Landlords, you're going to have to start keeping a lot more records around your tenancy and for 12 months after the tenancy ends. There's going to be changes to enforcement and fines and much, much more. Final date there, August 11, that may be earlier if government decides to, but that will be the changes around family violence where in one of those horrific situations where a tenant experiences this, they can end their tenancy early as long as there's evidence of that by way of a police report or something like that. And also to the physical assault of a landlord or their family member. So that will be the final change. 3 key dates, a lot of big changes, too much to kind of get into now, but join us for part 3 because there is a lot there. How are you seeing that when you hear that now, Pete?
Again, I think most people who are landlords would probably feel a bit overwhelmed by this. That unless you've been following this legislation over the last couple of years, because this has been building up gradually, suddenly being confronted by this, you will be overwhelmed. But you're just going to have to work your way through it.
And don't worry, because you can, and everything's entirely manageable. We have a quick act guide, we've got all the resources and tools, and it really is, it's just one of those things. I remember when I first started reading through the old 60 pages of legislation, it was a little daunting, but the more you read through it, the more you generate interest and you actually deep dive into it, it becomes very manageable, and trust me, you've got this covered, and we'll help you as well. Now, Pete, we're going to keep going through. I wanted to highlight our resource tonight. We've got this landlord compliance checklist and best practice guide. What we've got in this, you can request this from your Ray White property manager now. They've got them ready to go and they can send those through to you. We've highlighted 24 different landlord issues or components that you must adhere to. Now, I've broken them down into 3 sections. We've got property compliance, such as building code, unlawful dwellings, housing improvement regulations. We then look at the legislation compliance, like the Residential Tenancies Amendments Act, smoke alarm regulations, those sorts of things. And the final component is the tenancy compliance side, which is your issues like routine tenancy inspections, careless damage, landlord insurance, all that kind of stuff. Pete, what did you think when you first saw this document?
I'll tell you what, there was one thing that really jumped out at me, which is the requirement for, or the rules around, a person who's a property owner, a landlord, then in effect becoming a PCBU in terms of health and safety. And I've got to be really honest, my approach would probably have been that if I'm a landlord of a particular property and the plumber comes to do some repairs, they then are responsible themselves, and it's not on me, but in fact it is.
Yes, and actually the health and safety legislation is a few years old now, and we're all jointly responsible. We're all joint PCBUs in that piece. And it means we can't pass off that obligation to the electrician or the plumber. We're all joined, so you have to be making sure they're aware of any hazards at the property. And again, that's just one component. So, there's a lot there. And what we've done tonight, Pete, is we've picked out, I think, the key ones for everyone. This is where our property managers, in a survey that we put to the network, have said this is where a lot of our landlords come unstuck, or particularly the private landlords that we have coming to us. Now, the first one I want to talk about is unlawful dwellings. So, unlawful dwellings are those properties that were originally intended for something else and now they're being rented. So these are your things like your garages, your sleep outs. If you are charging rent for anything like that that's changed its state, please be very careful. And particularly if you're looking for new properties where a salesperson is telling you there's an income producing unit or a second property on the side, you've got to make sure you check. Any one of those dwellings needs building consent, council consent, and it needs to be approved for long-term habitable accommodation. We did a training session for our Ray White property managers early in the year. You're welcome to have access to that if you'd like to request that from them. But Pete, with unlawful dwellings, how do you check? How do you really find out if something's sound and built to code? What would you recommend for landlords watching tonight?
The tricky thing sometimes is that the actual amount of documentation kept at council varies dramatically across the country. I recently requested a property file on a property that was originally built in 1965, so not particularly old, nothing on file whatsoever. And the other thing is that one of the things that the Building Act itself is most concerned is to ensure a safe and sanitary place for people to live. And things like garage conversions, a carport gets some walls on it, becomes a garage, the garage becomes a sort of games room, and then it becomes a bedroom suddenly. It was never intended as a space that people are going to live in. So I think you need to be really clear that the occupied places on your property, whether that's the main dwelling, what used to be a garage or a sleep out, has in fact been incorporated into the building consent for the property. If it doesn't have a building consent for that particular use, then you're right, you shouldn't be renting it out.
And be very careful too, because if you get caught out in any of those scenarios, there is a risk, depending on the severity of the issue, that you might have to pay back all of the rent to the tenant, and we've seen those come through before with private landlords. So just be careful. That was a key one. Next one here on the list, so remember there's 24 on this document, we're just going through a couple of them. The housing improvement regulations. Now many landlords are blissfully unaware of this piece of legislation because it's been around for some time. I see it almost like the original Healthy Home Standard. It's sort of put in place rules around room size and ventilation and all sorts of things. Pete, as an example, you may already know this, but did you know the minimum room size required for a bedroom?
I know that in the current sort of Auckland unitary plan, or the design rules, they're actually saying that a bedroom should be no less than 10 square metres. But I'm guessing in terms of this, it's actually a little bit smaller.
Well, it depends on the age of the occupant.
Oh, okay.
So exactly, this is what I mean. We need help. We all need help to get up to speed with this. And there's so many different rules. I mean, you're just highlighting something different again.
Yeah.
This one says 6 square metres must be the smallest size that a bedroom can be. However, if the occupant is under 10 years of age, it can be slightly smaller. So again,
6 square metres, it's 2 by 3. We're not talking about massive spaces.
With the housing improvement regulations, though, I recommend all landlords search laws and bylaws tenancy services, and you'll find the full suite of details there all around the regulations on that component of it. Now the next one, this is a big one, Pete. This is careless damage and tenant liability. I've kind of tied them all together with landlord insurance and excess and events because they all work together. So last year we had the RTA Amendments Act 2019, and this brought in some big changes around tenant liability off the back of the historic/iconic Holler vs Osaki case. So did you hear about that one where this was a case where the tenant left a pot of boiling oil on the stove, carelessly kind of walked away, the house burnt down, and then the insurance company tried to come at the tenant for, I think it was $300,000. It went all the way to the highest courts and it was ruled that the tenants weren't liable. However, it changed everything here for us. So just to be very clear for landlords watching now, tenants are not liable for any damage that can be classed as an accident. Tenants are liable for any damage that could be classed as careless, like they should have known better, they shouldn't have walked away and left the pot of oil burning on the stove. However, if the tenant is liable for careless damage, their maximum liability is up to 4 weeks worth of rent or your landlord insurance excess, whichever is the lower. So again, if it's a big amount of damage, there's not a lot of cover there for landlords. Intentional damage, obviously tenants are fully liable for that. However, you have to prove that it was intentional. If there's any argument it was an accident or careless, you might not be so lucky in the tribunal. Pete, did you know also too, at the moment you're required to include your insurance details within any tenancy agreement?
Yeah, I was just made aware of that in a conversation with a property manager the other day, who said, because I think most landlords have got used to the idea that you need to be able to say what the installation is and a couple of other bits and pieces, but this is new as well. Now, who does that information go to?
As in?
The insurance certificate.
So basically in your tenancy agreement, it's like an insurance statement that you should have outlined for the tenant to say that we have cover, this is the cover, and this is the excess. And there's also a clause in there that states that the tenant is able to get a copy of your policy if they request it.
Okay. Question for you then. Can you then ask for an insurance certificate from a tenant?
I'm going to tell you the answer, but I bet you already have the answer.
No, I don't.
Well, you can't.
Okay.
It's not part of the rules.
All right.
So again, tenant insurance isn't compulsory, and this is why we're talking about the top tips of best practice for landlords. Careless damage and tenant liability is a huge risk area, and many landlords aren't aware. We recommend, I think we did it, 26% of our property managers have said their landlords don't have adequate landlord insurance cover for the right issues, despite us trying to get them to get the cover. And I list things there like excess, events, and conditions. So the reason I raise that is particularly around events. If you have a situation where, say, a tenant has a party and one of their friends or a friend of a friend they don't even know punches a whole lot of holes in the walls, some policies will class that as one event and there'll be one excess. Some policies will class each hole as its own event with its own excess. So again, landlord insurance is huge. You must look at your policy, and if you don't have the right cover in place, talk to us, because we can help put you in touch with the right people. The next one here, Pete, we talked about this the other day around the maintenance and expenditure buffer. What are your thoughts on this? Because we know this is a big issue for landlords and not reinvesting enough back into the property.
Yeah, and again, I come at it from a slightly different perspective, in the sense that one of the things I've been sort of speculating about, talking to people about, is, as a homeowner, right? Do you set aside a certain amount that you can use for maintenance? Now, it might be more than what you use, but often, the main reason that people defer maintenance is lack of cash, basically. So if you are able to put aside 0.5% of the value of a house, and I'm not just talking about rental properties, I'm talking about our own houses as well. So $500,000 property, if you can find one, is $2,500. Now, if you were to regularly spend $2,500 on a property, whether that's with an electrician one year or a plumber the next year, I think you could keep a lot of properties in pretty good nick. Now, if you don't spend it, then maybe there's some money there when you need to replace the roof or do the exterior painting and those sorts of things. And I guess, increasingly, if landlords are going to become more professional in their approach, then they need to become more business-like as well, and say, well, actually, a long-term cost is going to be maintenance, and I need to make provision for that.
And from your experience too, I think the long-term benefits of investing regularly into a property rather than trying to leave it all to the last minute, where in most cases you end up with larger costs as far as what we see.
Yep. Absolutely.
This is one of the big ones for landlords watching, and you raised a really good point before around sometimes it's a cash flow issue.
Sure.
I think if you're really right on that breadline of needing all of the income to pay the mortgage from the rental, it's something you're going to have to consider, because you need to have those funds aside, particularly as we're coming up to healthy homes costs and things like that. But we're going to touch on that soon. There's some resources there available. Another big issue, again, we've got a lot of information in your compliance guide, so make sure you request that. Now, the final top tip is around tenancy agreements. So landlords watching, listen carefully, because I might be able to save you $1,500. So I'm just making it clear, this is a current landlord requirement in terms of tenancy agreements. Right now, if you're signing up a new or renewed tenancy agreement, there are 3 statements that must be on there, and each of those statements carries a $500 fine if it's not included. The first one we talked about before is the insulation statement. Most of you will be well covered with that, all sorted. The next one is the Healthy Home Statement of Intent. That's needed today. So that's just a couple of lines to say, I understand, I agree, and our property will comply when it's needed to. And the third one is the insurance statement, where you're passing on those details around the insurance. Did you know that, Pete? Did you know there's those three requirements? Do you think many landlords are aware?
To be honest, the insurance one is something that I've only just become aware of.
How do you set up your tenancy agreements, or the people you know in those circles? What routes do they go down? Because we see a lot of landlords, they have their tenancy agreement from 8 years ago that they photocopy every single time.
Yeah.
What's your advice there on how to get the right agreements?
I think maybe it comes time for everyone to go, it's time for a review, right? And that's probably generally quite good advice, that if you, as we discussed right at the beginning, if you've been a landlord for a period of time and you think that things haven't changed, well, things have. So potentially, if you don't want to do it yourself, now is the time to consult with an expert and say, actually, how about you are a new set of eyes as to how I run this, right? And go, are my tenancy agreements up to date? Do I know what the compliance is? And do I have a system for recording all of that? Because that's going to become a big thing now too.
100%, and this is the records we're talking about and the changes that are coming in.
Yep.
And just a little plug I'll put in here, but a lot of our Ray White offices do find just a sort of a tenant finding service for landlords. Obviously, we'd love to manage your property and take care of the whole process. However, we can offer a tenant finding service where we actually do the paperwork and everything for you. So, or even a documentation check. So get in touch with your Ray White office there if you have any questions. Now, the final kind of component of tonight's content, before we move into some questions, I want to talk about landlords getting their property rent ready. I was really surprised at this. We did a survey of our network, and 92% of our property managers said that when they get a new property from a landlord, it's not ready to go.
Right.
There's still work needing to
So
be
what are
done.
the big things that are missing?
Perfect question, Pete. We're going to talk through them now.
Great.
So,
All right.
first one is your statements and your assessments. So you've heard a lot of that discussion already tonight. These are your Healthy Home Standard statements. I have to say, that next deadline, which is for most new or renewed agreements on the 1st of December, and the 13-page statement, we'll talk about that soon, but most of those will require some sort of inspection of the property, whether that's with a professional or yourself. You need to get a lot of measurements. If you are looking to use a professional, they are experiencing significant delays at the moment. There's a lot of pressure on them. You need to jump in there. If you're looking at buying a property or re-renting your own home, get rent ready, get it Healthy Homes assessed. That's the first one. Obviously, there's the compliance related and general property work. So a couple of components here. You've got the Healthy Home Standards, and I need to point out, for many landlords, they're not aware there are interest-free loans and support available specifically for healthy homes. I know ANZ and Westpac are a couple of banks that offer those. Some councils across New Zealand actually even allow you to apportion that cost back against your rates and pay that back over time. So investigate support options for landlords there. But Pete, I want to talk to you about general compliance work related, getting a property rent ready, tidying it up. Is it reasonably clean and tidy? What would you recommend a landlord do if they're either looking to rent a new home or in between tenancies?
I tell you what was interesting. I've been working on a property just recently, and in reading and preparing for tonight, it talks about ventilation. And then when you look through the legislation, what it's actually about is there must be an opening window in all of the habitable spaces, so bedrooms, living room, kitchen, etc. The interesting thing is when you read down a little bit more, that window needs to be able to stay open but have some sort of security on it. So it's not just a case of it being able to open, it needs to be able to open and have a security stay on it, and that needs to be in one window, at least in all of those spaces, or 5% of the floor area. So yes, you're going to have to do, you're going to get a tape measure out and get a calculator out and figure out these things.
But that's a perfect example of what is relatively an inexpensive cost by putting on some window stays. And then you're compliant. So again, talk to us, get our advice, get our help, because I think there's a lot of work landlords need to be doing before they even put it up online for rent, because at the moment all they're seeing is unnecessarily delays and reduced income streams, little things like that. Now, next up here on getting rent ready, we've talked about the importance of either the tenancy agreement, or if hopefully you choose to work with us, the management agreement. There's a lot of detail there. The best thing you can do is actually start having a look at this paperwork. Peter, have you heard of any of the old clauses that landlords are putting in their own tenancy agreements, or things that might not quite be lawful?
Yeah, I've heard something about carpet cleaning.
That is a big one. And again, this is why I say tenancy agreements and everything is so
Right.
important. Many landlords aren't aware that some of our private landlords we see have this old school clause in there that says tenants must professionally clean the carpets at the end of their tenancy.
Right.
That's actually an unlawful clause and it can't be enforced. Tenants can be liable for carpet cleaning in certain situations if there's pets or really drastic stains, but again, that kind of clause is actually contracting outside of the Act. So if you're looking to get rent ready, make sure you've got the right paperwork. We're going to keep going through because we've got a few questions to get through and not much time there for everyone. The first step is very important. This is key for any landlord, is doing things properly at the start. This is your tenant selection, your tenant vetting and your tenant induction. You know, Pete, do you have any advice for landlords here around that very first step of how to get things set up well for a tenant and for a landlord?
I think, you know, in some cases I know people who are landlords who are more than comfortable meeting their tenants, and they actually find that sort of personal relationship helps the tenant-landlord relationship right throughout. Other people, as more and more people potentially get into property investment, that's not something that they're particularly comfortable with, in which case you are reliant on the skill and ability of the person that you've chosen to be your property manager, in which case you're putting a lot of trust in that person.
Yes.
So it's probably as much about vetting the property manager, if you're going down that path, as it is the tenant.
Really good point. And I think with any property manager, if you are using them to help you find a tenant or to manage your properties, shop around, ask a few questions, find the right one who fits you and your investment goals and ambitions, your ideals, your values. Don't just pick the first one that comes along, because property managers aren't all created equal. We can certainly attest to that. But I have to say the first step is crucial. You need to set up really clear boundaries and expectations with your tenants and around your joint responsibilities. So when you sign up a new tenant, talk to them about, have a checklist, talk to them about things like routine inspections, how often you're going to come to the property, what happens with maintenance, who do you call. Look, we do have a Ray White tenant information guide you can request. It's free. You can use that as a guide to create your own checklist if you like. So that's another step there. This final one here, Pete, I was wary of putting it in tonight. However, in the survey of our property managers, this was by far the most frequent comment around where landlords are coming unstuck. Are you familiar with the sort of limbo state we're operating in at the moment around methamphetamine?
Yeah, that's been such a contentious issue for a long time. I think what we saw was a massive overreaction to the scale of the problem and to the health risks associated with it, in my opinion. And that's been borne out by, I think, Peter Gluckman, who did the review, changed all of the standards. And unfortunately, I think we've all seen, and I've seen, examples of people being rorted. Basically where the property's been deemed to be unsafe, the next thing it's being gutted, and that was completely unnecessary. Yes. So I think there's probably a little bit of sensibility that's come back into that space, thankfully.
And look, part of that recommendation around methamphetamine testing is it's still the only way to be sure of where your property sits. At the end of the day, no matter what happens, if there's a bad situation, touch wood, where you're trying to get some compensation or insurance sorted, you need to have a before and after. Many landlords are still foregoing this test, and it's just something I wanted to raise. Again, like you sort of alluded to, there's so much to unpack there in that one issue alone. We won't go into detail with that tonight, but talk to your Ray White property manager. We've got all sorts of information there. But that is something that's kind of flown under the radar a little bit, and I just wanted to raise that tonight. So what we're doing, we're running slightly over time, team, but obviously if you're missing this, don't worry, you can come back and re-watch it. We're going to get through to some of our most common questions that we've received throughout the session. How do I find the cost of healthy home standards compliance for my rental property? What did you say there, Pete?
Again, discussion I had with someone the other day presented me with a range of costs from $130 through to about $350 for, well, basically the same report. And then, you know, what I would be concerned about as a property owner is to go, how do I know the experience and expertise of the people that are coming to do those reports? And then do I have a right to challenge them as well?
Again, bang on there, not every single Healthy Homes assessor is created equal. Even when we were looking at who do we recommend to our landlords, we didn't pick any one specific supplier for that reason. What we do have though is a list of about 10 or 11 different questions that you can ask a Healthy Homes assessor. So if you want a copy of those, let us know. But in terms of getting the cost of what you need to do to comply, that is the only way, is get an assessment done. Great question here, or self-assess. Do you have to have a certificate of compliance for healthy homes, or can you just tick the boxes on the tenancy agreement? We've already answered that one tonight. There's a 13-page statement that you must complete. It's not a tick box.
It is. No.
Now this one, Pete, heating. This came up over and over again in the questions. What are your thoughts here?
Look,
what questions?
Again, I always go back to what's going to be the best thing for the occupants of the house. And World Health Organization will all say heating is a crucial component to having a healthy home. So let's give up on banging the drum about, why do we have to do it? The fact is it's really important to do. Are there good ways of doing it? Yes, there are. So there are some things that you can't do. Unflued gas heaters, they don't comply. Open fireplaces, they don't comply. For obvious reasons, they are inefficient, and then it leaves the burden of providing the fuel for that to potentially a tenant. I don't think any landlord wants to buy firewood for people. However, I do think in some cases people are not understanding that there are a range of options. So, in one property we're installing a heat pump at the moment because that's the best solution for that property, but there are other solutions. So again, if you are a landlord, if you're looking to comply, make sure that you use the online tool. I actually did that. I did it actually on my own house because I was kind of curious just to see what it might be that I needed. And it takes a little bit of mathematics, but it's really worth doing. And then, if when you know the target that you have to achieve, then you can find out what the best source of heating is.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That is the first step for landlords, is head online, tenancy.govt.nz, search that online heating calculator, because that's going to give you the answers you need that dictates all the rest.
Yeah.
You need to know what your space is, what it needs. You punch in your insulation, the window areas, the floor areas of the living rooms. That's your first step.
Yeah, it's really comprehensive, and it's going to take you a little bit of time to go through and do it. You need to go out and measure all of the spaces that you've got. You need to understand a little bit about how your house is constructed as well, because it takes into account the thermal performance of the exterior of the building. So if you are in a property, or if you have a property that is fully insulated, then obviously your heating requirement is arguably going to be a little bit less. If you're in a property that is poorly insulated, then you're going to have to put more energy into heating it.
There's so much detail to that heating standard, and we just noticed that with the questions coming through. So as part of your education here with the Landlord Academy series, join us next week, because we'll be going into more detail there, working through these. When applying healthy homes exemptions, particularly not reasonably practical to install, can a landlord make this judgment if it's justified? Comes down to your experience, and at the end of the day, if you say something is exempt from the standard, you have to be prepared to prove it in tribunal. Simple as that. Do all properties need to be assessed for healthy homes? My rental is only 8 years old. Yes, every home must have a statement. And generally speaking, a statement comes from an assessment, whether that's a professional assessor or yourself. We touched on the heating issue before, but believe it or not, Pete, the heating standard is actually set to a higher level than the current building code.
There is nothing in the building code for heating. So it's a long story, but potentially it's quite interesting that the Residential Tenancies Act demands a higher standard of our houses than the building code does.
And that's why it's such an important issue for all of you. Just get across this and get into it. Now, next one here down the bottom, can I complete the Healthy Homes assessment myself? Now, I know, Pete, you've gone through and you've worked through it.
Yep.
Do you think most landlords can do that?
I think you'd have to have, if not a fair degree of competency around understanding the building, a fair degree of passion for your building. You actually have to be genuinely interested in it. And I say that because I've had discussions with people who couldn't even describe the type of cladding that they've got on their house. So if that's where your level of understanding of the building that you own is, then you probably can't do it. I think if you have a general interest in the building, I think you'll be able to work your way through it.
Just quickly, can you, or were you able to complete the Healthy Homes assessment, sort of 13-page paperwork, without physically visiting the property?
I can't see how you would, and I don't think that's desirable, is it? I mean, no. You would want to be there seeing it, and it's a good excuse to go to the property.
I just make that as a pointed comment.
Absolutely.
Because we get a lot of landlords saying, just send it through and I'll fill it out.
Yeah.
And our common rebuttal is, well, when would you like a book and a time to go see the home?
Yep.
You need to see it, you need the measurement. So final slide here with our questions. With the new rules coming on landlords, Can landlords ask to have a property vacated on a specific date? So this is part of the RTA Amendments Act. This is a slightly tricky one in terms of termination notices for tenants. This all comes to effect on the 11th of February next year. Now, if you send a periodic tenant notice to vacate on or after the 11th of February, it has to be with the new timeframes. So if you've got an unconditional sale, that becomes 90 days from the 11th of February onwards. If you send the notice on the 8th of February, that's still 42 days.
Right.
If you have a fixed term tenancy, the rules apply at the time the tenancy was signed. So some of those tenancies will carry over with the old rules. But again, a lot of detail on that one in our third part of the series. But effectively, as we move forward, landlords are going to have to be very, very careful around the types of leases they sign in relation to their long-term plans for the property, particularly if they want to move back in or sell. How much notice needs to be given to tenants when the home is being sold? At the moment, that's 42 days.
42 days.
Same answer if you want to move back in yourself. 11th of February onwards next year, it'll be 63 days notice if you want to move back into the property, or 90 days once the home has unconditionally sold. This is a big one we're going to...
Yeah, I was going to say, and there's some, again, I was reading the other day that, let's say you say that I'm going to give notice because a family member wants to move in. There's now a minimum period of occupancy, a time for that family member as well. So, you know, if some landlords perhaps were tempted to sort of rort the system by going, hey, look, my son's moving in, my cousin's moving in, and then they move out 2 days later, that's not going to fly anymore, is it?
No, definitely not.
Right.
And it's very easy to tell, and that's the kind of thing that you just can't get away with at the moment, particularly as we go through to the RTA Act. The fines are going to be significant for those sorts of things. So people need to be very careful there when we have that come through on the 11th of February. So we're mindful though, just keep third session, I think it's the 19th of November. This is going to be the RTA Amendments Act deep dive. There is a lot there. And this one question came up a lot too, Pete. Can I give notice to end a tenancy if I'd like to change to short-term Airbnb accommodation? There are a lot of landlords across New Zealand, particularly in some of the holiday areas, whether that's Queenstown or Whangamata, where they have Airbnb accommodation during the summer and then fixed-term tenancies during the year.
I would imagine that those days are over.
Exactly.
Yep.
So join us in part 3 where we'll be going into a deep dive there, because fortunately or unfortunately, landlords are just going to have to make a decision around their pathway for their investment property, and you can't really switch between the two anymore. Now, what we're going to do, because we're running so over time, we're going to cover off a lot of your live questions in the coming series. So stay tuned for next week and the week after, every Thursday night. And don't worry, any question we get sent through, we will answer, even if it means me doing a bit of a recording and sending it through to people at the end of the series. Send your questions through and we will answer them. Now, don't forget, next week we've got our next session there with Joanne Ray, the Head of Property Management from the Real Estate Institute. A few key sites I want to highlight for all landlords watching right now. We've obviously got raywhite.co.nz. That's your database to find your local property management office if you'd like to request your landlord compliance guide or checklist, the unlawful dwellings training we talked about, help with tenancy agreements. You can find your office there. If you want to do some independent research, because I know many of you prefer to do it yourselves, have a look, tenancy.govt.nz or landlords.co.nz, a couple of great sites there for DIY landlords. Don't forget to request your copy of our free guide. And finally, I'd just like to say to everyone tonight, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you having us here for our first and inaugural Landlord Academy series. We can't wait to see you next time. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week.
Take care.